Let me just get this out of the way. I played through all of Deathloop. I feel as though I've given it a fair chance to impress me, and after dozens and dozens of hours with it, I can't help but feel as though the press's reaction and subsequent evaluation of the game's worth was remarkably disconnected from reality. Plethora laudations were levied against the game, some claiming that the game was a triumph, endlessly impressive, and some even called it a masterpiece. Indeed, it sounds as though we're describing literally anything that Leonardo DiCaprio has ever done, but in actuality, we're describing something that is much more controversial, somehow. You see, in my opinion, Deathloop is far from a masterpiece. In fact, Arcane Studios made some choices with this game that are so baffling to me that I frankly have a difficult time believing that the game's media who covered it weren't aware of its shortcomings, but rather were willingly ignorant of them. The fact that some reviewers gave this a 9 or even a perfect 10 is nothing short of laughable in my mind. I know, we all have our respective opinions, and disagreements are to be expected and even encouraged. But when someone is arguing that a game is perfect or near perfect, there is a burden of proof placed on them, not the person that's skeptical of that evaluation. If you're calling something perfect, show it's perfect. After all, that's why my videos tend to be so long. There is a burden of proof when you make a claim. If I say that Assassin's Creed Valhalla is a low point for the series and that there are plethora issues with it, I need to defend that point. It's the same as if I praise a game, and certainly if I claim that it's perfect or close to it. So, because I'm making the claim that Deathloop really isn't very good, I'm going to try and justify it, unlike those critics that just gave it a blanket 10 out of 10 saying it was really cool because it did time loop stuff and was funny. Timestamps below, like, subscribe, you know what to do, blah blah blah. First, before we get into it, I need to thank our sponsor for this video, Salad. Salad is the innovative company offering everyday people a chance to make money while their computer is doing absolutely nothing. The service basically uses your computer's power to help a bunch of other computers all across the globe solve complex math equations that can be sold, in effect, generating you money, and doing so without any real effort on your part. Now, I know this type of thing has always been kind of sketchy, which was my first thought as well. So I did a lot of digging, and Salad actually has made it really easy to vet them. They've made their source code readily available for you to peruse and evaluate yourself, and they also have amazing ratings on Trustpilot, so you can see what everyday people who are actually using their services think. As always, you should do your own homework, which is what Salad wants you to do and what I want you to do. Don't take my word for it, don't take their word for it. Investigate. I think you'll be pretty impressed with what you find though. Again, vet them yourself. I think you'll be impressed just like I was. Links in the description box below and in the pinned comment at the very top. Check it out, no obligation. See what you think. Again, I think you'll be impressed. Now, the first thing we need to get out of the way up front is Deathloop's performance. Hopefully this won't be an issue in the future. My expectation is that in the coming months, all of these issues I'm about to whine about will have been remedied. But as of right now, the first month or so of the game's existence, it's been rife with bugs and glitches and all sorts of soft locks as well that make the game almost impossible to play for any extended period of time without extreme patience and the self-control of a celibate monk at a brothel trying to avoid smashing his PC. But I do think it's important to know. I ran into a bunch of bugs, but most of them barely impacted the gameplay experience. I'll be perfectly honest about that. The most common one I would encounter would be when I would come across NPCs that would just stare blankly at me, incapable of spotting me and alerting others to my presence when I was even just 10 feet away. And I'm sure this is going to be patched out relatively quickly. I'm sure they'll figure it out. But I do think it's important to note that by the time I got this close to most enemies, I was probably already engaged with them in combat anyways. I was usually the instigator after all. So it wasn't that big of a deal, all things considered. I can kind of forgive this one. Maybe not forgive, maybe more look past it, because it's not something you will probably notice unless you're looking for it. It's one of those things, like once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. That's basically what's going on here. But what is a big deal, and still is, are the uncontrollable soft locks that happen randomly when you pull up menus. To be precise, I'm playing on PlayStation 5. I chose this because I heard that the PC port has been having all sorts of issues, even more than the PS5 version, so I just decided to grit my teeth and play this first-person shooter on a controller, which pained me greatly. Basically what happens is that you'll be in the middle of a mission. You'll pull up the menu to check an objective or study a clue or something, and then when you hit circle to back out of the menu, it will do so only partially. Effectively, you'll be stuck in this half menu, unable to close it in perpetuity. And there's no workaround for this. The first time it happened to me, I hopped on my phone and started Googling solutions. It was the day that the game had come out, so it was really hard to find any answers whatsoever, but I did notice that a lot of people on Twitter had encountered the same basic thing. Unfortunately, there were no fixes. Based on my preliminary research, it seems as though this has something to do with the game's online system breaking down. Basically, you pull up the menu, but the game still has to remain tied to a server. And if you have Juliana in the map with you and you try to close the menu, it gets caught sort of in a limbo, trying to communicate between your system and the server. It's just a mess. Or the other option is that it's just broken. I don't know what I'm talking about. But the point is that this bug caused me to lose probably around 45 minutes of progress on multiple occasions, because some of these runs you'll be doing, especially later in the game, go on for a while, and getting soft locked towards the end after taking out Juliana, after defeating a few of the bosses and collecting all of this amazing stuff, to get caught in this soft lock just sucks. The closest thing I can point to this reminding me of would be the crashes in Returnal that they suffered a lot of at launch. And it's just frustrating because games like this with strict autosave systems, I just don't think can acceptably be this unstable. It's frankly unacceptable. I don't care if it's an Xbox studio or a PS5 exclusive, or if it's from one of the preeminent developers in the industry, or all of the above. This just isn't acceptable for a $60 game. And what's more, the fact that developers encountered bugs like this and still gave it a 10 is just amazing. Now, the other issue I wanted to discuss is one that I'm not actually sure is a technical issue. It's the AI, like I mentioned. The NPCs in this game are freakishly stupid. So stupid, I don't know if the game is breaking or if they were just designed in a lazy way. They have little to no investigative ability, no memory at all. They can discover you, turn around, and completely forget where you were. Their lines of sight are extremely inconsistent and often don't feel fair at the same time somehow. And they regularly took me out of any sort of immersive state I was in thanks to said stupidity. Now, listen, at first thought, I thought this was a technical issue, maybe a bug. There were other ones, so who's to say this couldn't also be a bug? How is it possible, after all, that we can get to 2021 and still deal with freakishly stupid AI in a game that's all about stealth and creative gameplay? But the more I played, the less I feel as though it's a technical issue or something that could just be patched out. It's much more akin to the AI issues in Cyberpunk, where from the ground up, it was not a priority to have these NPCs be intelligent in any sort of meaningful way, so they just didn't try. And now we just have freakishly stupid NPCs, and there's not much you can do about it. All of these enemies are stupid, and the levels are designed around that stupidity, which is my main issue with it. Maybe I have rose-tinted glasses, but I don't think the NPCs were anywhere near this stupid, even in the original Dishonored. Nevertheless, it was such a prevalent thing, I felt I had to address it. There were many more instances when I was playing through a level and thought to myself, wow, these things are really stupid. And after speaking to some of the other people who have played the game on Twitter or in my personal life or over on our Discord, I can confidently say that I'm not the only one who has encountered this, and it seems as though this is a common evaluation, that the AI is just stupid. It's more just a matter of whether or not you're willing to forgive it or overlook it, because most players will probably be the first one to engage in combat and thus might not notice it as frequently as others. There are also a lot of weird inconsistencies, such as this one where I was able to retrieve a bottle of fizz pop through a bulletproof glass window, but for some reason I also can't teleport through it using the dash ability, so I can do one thing through the glass but not the other. It's not a big deal, but it does show that there is a lack of polish surrounding these smaller details, something that's not normal for Arcane Studios. Normally, they've got this stuff down pat. Speaking of, what does down pat even mean? I wrote it in the script. I just realized I don't... Down pat? Is Pat a guy? Why is he down? That just broke my brain. If you know, comment. I could Google it, I guess, but I'll probably forget until I upload this, so comment. In spite of the instability, though, the game still has a lot that's going on that's impressive, and it's certainly fair to praise it for these achievements. For example, there's a good amount of weapon variety here, and each of the weapons can be customized using trinkets that you find on visionaries, high-leveled enemies, or just out in the world while you're exploring. These can do things such as increasing the fire rate of the weapon, making it quicker to swap between weapons, or even making it so the rounds fired from that weapon travel through targets and don't just stop at the first enemy that they make contact with, making it far easier to clear out large groups. And thankfully, there's a really good number of these trinkets, but for most weapon classes and types, there are only a handful of these trinkets that make sense to apply to that specific weapon. For instance, the best gun that I came across in the game was this large shotgun that I built out with improved fire rate, larger clip sizes, increased damage over distance, and all of this effectively turned the shotgun into a deer slug machine gun. I actually counted it up, and after I built out the shotgun, I didn't lose a single Juliana fight for more than 20 cycles. Often, it didn't even feel fair. If you could get within like 5 meters of any enemy, you would just wipe them off the face of the earth within the span of a couple seconds. I mean, here's just a short compilation of some of these kills. It just feels like you're beating up a baby horse. Yeah, my analogies are on point. Don't get me wrong, this felt pretty awesome to play with, and I felt like a god going against these other players with this weapon. If they were coming at me with a machine gun or a decked out pistol, they literally didn't stand a chance. But what I will say is that this coin has two sides to it. I'm not about to go and pretend as though these were good gunfights. Even saying that these were fun encounters is a bit of a stretch because there was no challenge at all. After a while, it just started feeling like taking candy from a baby or beating up a baby horse. And normally in this situation, I would just swap weapons and try to fight with Juliana using a more evenly matched weapon. However, because these fights have actual stakes, especially if you're engaging with Juliana later in the day, I'll be damned if I get killed and have to restart the day and redo everything that I just did for the last half hour to get to that point. So the result is that I just used this incredibly overpowered weapon in all of these fights, wiping Juliana within a few seconds of making contact with her every single time for like 20 cycles in a row. And while I may carry along my merry way, whoever was playing as Juliana in these moments, I'm sure was left extremely frustrated and baffled as to what just happened. And furthermore, to make it worse, because these queue times to get into a lobby with a cult as Juliana are so freakishly long, even this close to launch, it often takes 5 to 10 minutes just to get matched with another player. And in this case, if they got matched with me, they would just get wiped out within a few seconds of the round beginning. So while it may be a quick sidetrack for me, for them, it just ruined and wasted 5 to 10 minutes of their time, depending on how much time they were sitting in that lobby for. And because you have to level up Juliana's gear separately from Colt's, something that at the outset sounds great, you're going to have to put up with a lot of this tedium and, I can't think of a better word for it, griefing before you can get any weapons that can realistically go up against Colt and this meta shotgun. I don't know how the matchmaking works in this game. It could be that they only pair low level and poorly equipped Colts with Julianas, but I don't know if that's the case. At the very least, it could, I guess, explain some of the long queue times that you experience, but it could also be that they just don't have many people trying to play as Juliana at the same time compared to how many people are playing as Colt, I really don't know. What I do know is that if they already are having issues matching up Julianas and Colts and the queue times are long, even at launch, when everybody's hyped up because gaming journalists are calling this a perfect masterpiece, they probably are only going to get worse, like a lot worse as time goes by. It wouldn't surprise me if in a year you're only going to play against AI versions of Colt and Juliana because there will be basically no players left. And really, I can't blame players for not wanting to engage with this. I mean, realistically, there can't possibly be that many people who want to play Deathloop and then sit in long queues for 5, 10, 15 minutes at a time, only to load in and instantly be griefed by somebody playing with a broken weapon. I, for one, fall into this category. I get that it could be really fun to hunt down Colt in these levels, but the quality of the gameplay and the environment design and how broken it is all contribute to a really low enjoyment of this mode. Especially when you compare it to the base game, it's just nowhere near where it needs to be. Even though it seems as though this is presented as a quarter of what this game has to offer, arguably even a half of what Deathloop has to offer, because when you load into the game, it takes up half of the screen real estate. All told, the Juliana sections are just bad. I think it could have been really fun to have these dynamic invasions by other players, especially ones that tie into the main story and are scripted. Literally, they have like actual scripts of dialogue that plays out. It's a cool idea, and I think it could have been executed way better because right now it's just broken, and for one side of it, 90% of the time it's just not fun. We're just getting started. Like, that's one of the big selling points of this game, was that you could play as Colt and Juliana, fight against other players, try to throw them off the trail, and like that's a huge part of this game. And it's just not good. But moving on from that, let's discuss the central theme of the game, the loop. Everything in this game takes place over the course of a single day that keeps repeating. The day is split into 4 time periods: morning, noon, afternoon, and evening. And this means that you can travel to each of the 4 areas in the map once a day, and since certain people and events only happen in one area at a certain time of the day, this leads to some interesting variety in the levels and exploration, because you'll head to one area one moment and another area a different moment, and the next loop, when everything resets, you might shake it up and try a different arrangement. But while this initially sounds interesting, it does introduce a couple of issues, namely the problems of repetition and map stagnation. Don't get it twisted, okay? The game has effectively 4 maps. Each of these is fairly well built and realized, I'll grant you that. They're small, but they combine into a much larger map that makes up Black Reef. At first, I was really excited at the idea that the game had 4 separate maps that you could play in. But after 5 or so hours of gameplay, you'll realize that you've seen everything that these maps have to offer across all 4 times of day, because the maps don't change from morning to noon, afternoon, evening. The characters and placement of enemies shifts slightly, but there's not enough variability to make exploring the levels feel unique from each time of the day to a different time of the day. And as a result, the levels feel extremely small, and by the end of the game, you will be sick and tired of running through the same routes, jumping on the same rooftops, through the same windows every single time you go through the loop. Simply, the maps themselves don't change enough from time of day to time of day to justify being so freakishly small. If they were this small, but they changed a lot, I would get it. But no, they're just really small maps without any reward or cool novelty that makes it worth it. Furthermore, because you're going to be returning to the same locations so frequently, namely the locations that the visionaries are in, you'll eventually settle on your go-to route for every location, even though I don't think the developers wanted this to happen. For me, this happened within a few hours of the game. I knew which route I was going to take to each visionary or central location, and I would take that same route every single time because it was the fastest and safest route you could take. And this means that no matter how good the level design is, no matter how many different routes there are that the designers have carefully routed out to the location, players will inevitably settle on one and stick to it simply for sake of efficiency. People often praise Arcane for their fantastic level design, which is certainly well deserved. Dishonored and Dishonored 2 and even Prey have some of the best level design in the industry. And that's not an exaggeration. And one of the things that level design gives Arcane games is a fantastic amount of replayability, something that many players were hoping to see in Deathloop, including myself. But by the time you get to the end of the game, you will realize that Deathloop doesn't have much, if any, replayability at its disposal. By the time you get to the end of the game, you will have gone through these levels so many freaking times that you will be begging for something new. And this is for me when I realized that the game does have replay value, but only within itself. In other words, going through the levels repeatedly is enjoyable, but the difference is that because the game's story and structure is set up the way it is, you're going to be going through it time and time and time and time and time again, repeatedly, over the course of the main campaign itself. It would be like in Dishonored if you were tasked with assassinating the same character 20 times in a row before you could move on to the next mission. You would go through that level many, many times, effectively replaying it in order to achieve that goal that they arbitrarily set out for you. And most likely, by the end of that 20th time, you would probably be sick and tired of running through that singular level. And that's precisely why Dishonored didn't do this. They had fantastic levels and they had targets that you had to hunt in those levels, but they let you go through them, eliminate the target, and get out to move on to the next target. If you wanted to come back to that mission, you could do so and replay it the way you wanted to on your terms. But in Deathloop, you're forced to go through the same series of events, same levels, and same set pieces dozens upon dozens of times. And by the time you get to the credits, you'll be sick of it. And listen, I can see why Arcane would think that this was a good idea. After all, people have praised their previous games for being fantastically replayable and most importantly, enjoyable when engaging with multiple times over, blah, blah, blah. So why wouldn't it work to make an experience like that the entire game? Make a game where the core gameplay loop is replayability. And that's where Deathloop both succeeds and fails, to be perfectly honest. The only reason its time loop mechanic doesn't grow extremely frustrating and boring is because the levels are designed so well. But even so, they fall flat by the end of the game because while they are interesting and well put together, they aren't magic. They don't change enough from morning to afternoon to evening to carry this experience on their own. And it's all made worse by the terrible AI that means there's very little, if any, dynamic gameplay. You aren't going to find yourself exploring one route that you've gone on 50 times only to find out that there's a new patrol hanging out there because the game has some sort of meta AI that's learning how you play and they see this route's traveled and they put guards there forcing you to go a different route. That would have been cool. That would have been awesome. But they didn't do it. Or if they did, it doesn't work. But thankfully, the core gameplay loop is interesting enough with all of the various slabs that you'll unlock that I think most players will probably feel pretty pleased with. And the variety in those slabs also is fantastic. There's all sorts of solutions that can be found to certain gameplay problems, specifically with these slabs. It feels great, and I think these abilities add a lot to both the level, exploration, and the combat. For instance, there's a bunch of different ways that you can take out enemies, whether it's by way of stealth or just brute strength if you happen to prefer that. Different abilities like Ether, Dash, and even Carnesis present the player all sorts of different tools that each feel fleshed out and fun to engage with. And they're made all the better with the upgrades that can be added to the slabs once you find them in the world. I know some people have complained that these just feel like glorified versions of the abilities in Dishonored, which I guess is also a fair criticism, but it feels odd to call that a criticism because those abilities felt fantastic. So it's like calling somebody too sexy. It just, it's an oxymoron. It doesn't make sense. Like, stop being sexy. You're a nice guy. It doesn't work. It doesn't make sense. The point is, the slabs I really like. I don't have an issue with these. I, if anything, wish there were more of them. But I think what is here is well thought out, polished, and there's some really cool moments you can have with all sorts of these abilities in tandem. That being said, while the tools are there to have fantastic gameplay variety, the narrative of the game doesn't seem to want the player to make their own way or chart their own course. And this, I think, is the most egregious example of the game holding the player's hand far too much. To put it simply, all narratively branching games have an illusion of choice, at least to a certain extent. Even games that have fantastic consequences built into them hide moments that must remain on tracks, with the illusion of player agency being the primary mode of control. It's the literal magic of game design, using misdirection and illusion to create an experience otherwise impossible. But the thing is, Deathloop doesn't give the player the keys to the car, like, at all. They set all of this up with an interesting world, kooky characters, a series of puzzles that the player can solve, and even a time loop that can be broken if the player puts everything together in just the right way. But Arcane decided to ignore all of that potential and just guide the player story beat by story beat by story beat, gameplay objective by gameplay objective, and target by target, all the way to the ending credits. And it's so frustrating. They just miss out on all of the potential that they had set up. But more on that in just a second. Speaking of endings, there are multiples, but they are dependent, as far as I can tell, on one decision that you make in the last 30 seconds or so. Everything prior to that is on extreme train tracks, which is just frustrating and upsetting and just sucks. Especially considering that this is a game set within a time loop. There's so much potential for cool narrative stuff to go on here. Other titles have used this gimmick, such as The Forgotten City, which I've praised highly. You should play it if you haven't. Or 12 Minutes, which both gave the player a lot more agency. You know, there's a mystery as to how you're going to escape this loop, and you need to figure it out in your own way. And when you do, it's the most satisfying thing on the planet because you solved it. You figured it out, and that makes you awesome. You feel amazing because of it. That feeling of success and satisfaction is just not here. Because in Deathloop, the player isn't going to be the one solving the puzzle. The game does it for you. And it is such a ridiculously comprehensive series of objective markers that the player will never really have to think in order to progress through the game. Like, at all. The only time I felt as though I needed to pause and figure out how I was going to achieve the goal presented to me was when Alexis has to be identified at his house party. And the solution is a little more complicated than I expected. Basically, you have to go into his private residence, look at the DJ mix board that he has there, find out which mix he's using that he's so proud of on that particular loop, which, to be specific, will change every single loop, so you can't simply memorize one number and reuse it time and time again. And then you have to run all the way back to the main dance hall, enter it into the mix board there in the DJ booth, and he gets all excited that his wonderful mix is playing, and he reveals himself. But even this wasn't really an issue, because using the various abilities such as Nexus, you're able to clear out an entire room of enemies without any effort at all. So it really doesn't matter if you know precisely which of these masked figures is your target. It's like shooting fish in a barrel, or in this case, a school of fish in a barrel. However, the game, of course, needed to put all of this together so that they could check off that box, so they could know that the player would be able to figure out where Colt needed to go to kill Alexis in the final loop when you have to kill all of them at the same time. Now, of course, we know that this game has a fair amount of bugs, so perhaps you don't actually need to complete this quest line in order to get to the end, and the restriction put on me was simply a result of a contingency state not triggering, but I'm not sure. What I do know is that the game seemed to present one task, which was discover Alexis, which one he is, and once I did that, I was good and the story progressed, even though clearly I don't need to identify which one he is to eliminate him. But again, that's just a small nitpicky thing. That's not that big of a deal. I mean, I think it's kind of fun to discover which one he is, even if in the final loop I didn't bother doing that. The point is, time loop games are, in my opinion, best when they give the player the keys to the kingdom and ask them to solve the mystery themselves. I get it. Deathloop is not a puzzle game, blah, 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 nor does it claim to be one, but I can't help it. It feels as though they missed out on so many opportunities that could have made players and their experience a lot more engaging. If the player had to solve all of these puzzles themselves, figure out how to draw one character into a new area, how to motivate a different visionary to do different things, it would be much more meaningful and memorable. I'll bring it up again because it's fantastic, but The Forgotten City is a tremendous example of when this can go well. There's a series of things you have to do in order to break the time loop in that game, and each of them are quite complicated, but the game doesn't hold your hand. It expects you to rise to the occasion and figure it out. And you do have to do that. You have to figure out how to solve the puzzles, and if you can't figure it out, you're just stuck. The developers, in the case of The Forgotten City, just 3 people, trusted the players to figure out what they needed to do to solve the puzzles, and it resulted in an experience that I personally would consider much more memorable and meaningful than Deathloop's. If that game does sound interesting to you, by the way, don't worry. I do have a critique in the works, so make sure to subscribe to see that video when it comes out. And if you want to see my little essay that I did on it, I'll also have that linked below. The developers actually retweeted it, so I know that they approve of what I have to say about it. So, yeah. Also, while I'm here, become a channel member by pressing the little join button below so that you can see every major critique video that I do a full week before anybody else. Not to mention, you'll also get super cool badges next to your name in all of the comments and the live stream chats that we do, so it's really cool. But enough about that. The point of all of this is to say that I feel as though Deathloop has a lot of issues. And I know these videos often seem as though I'm just being endlessly complainy and I'm ranting about something that's pretty good, but I'm just trying to find reasons to hate on it. And unfortunately, I think that's just a side effect of how these videos work. They're critiques. The entire point of these videos is to point out all of the issues. But don't let that discourage you from trying the game. There's a lot of really good stuff here that's going on in Deathloop. The weapon variety is great. The abilities feel good to use. And the random invasions by other players, or in some cases in AI, if they can't find another player to play as Juliana against you, often feel pretty fun. Sure, sometimes you feel as though you're griefing on them, but maybe that's just the way it should be. And in addition to all of this, there's even goofy dialogue that takes place between NPCs and different characters, and all of it contributes to this game feeling very unique and in some cases pretty memorable, especially with regards to the relationship between Colt and Juliana. It's one that grows and changes over the course of the campaign very naturally, at least to a certain extent. If you've played the game, you probably know what I'm talking about. Their banter is fantastic, and I was always excited to start a new loop so that I could hear what funny things they were going to say to each other next. But to wrap this up, even though I did just spend an entire video ranting about how many things are wrong with this game, I did enjoy my time with it. I won't be replaying it anytime soon, if ever. Not because I think it's bad, but because the gameplay structure is just so dependent on going through these motions and grinding out these checkboxes one by one. To put it succinctly, I just feel as though I've seen all that the game has to offer. It's no masterpiece, and the technical issues alone, I feel, disqualifies it from a 10 out of 10 rating, and I would say even a 9 out of 10 rating. A rating that is still baffling to me. Seriously, I just don't get how you get to a 10 out of 10 for this. The game's not awful, but it's nowhere near the likes of other 10 out of 10 titles or even 9 out of 10 titles. I don't see how you could put this in the leagues of The Witcher 3, Red Dead Redemption 2, GTA 5, Skyrim. I don't see it. If I had to give a number to this game, I would give it probably an 8 out of 10. It's good, but buggy. It's better than average, but when I look back on all of the games that I've played this year alone, it really does fail to stand out as a truly remarkable game in a sea of unique and extremely creative titles, like It Takes Two, The Forgotten City, and Psychonauts 2. More than anything, it just left me wishing that Arcane had tried something a little bit more daring and less controlled. It's a game about a time loop. If ever there was a time to give players the complete control of the narrative and quest structure, this was it. So here's hoping that the next game, Redfall, takes them out of their comfort zone a little bit more. And hopefully that's at least what I think. We will see Arcane do something truly fantastic, not so bland, repetitive, and underwhelming. But that's it from me. Thank you for watching. I love you all more than you could possibly know. Like the video if you liked it, dislike if you disliked it. Make sure to subscribe to see more content just like this. And like I said, let me know where down pat comes from. I really don't know. I'll look forward to hearing your thoughts. Talk to you guys later. I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.